In the meantime, I've kind of added to my little sketch pad here the just to visualize what I was saying. This is a box, and this is a brain over here. I'm not going to guide my hand here. There's a brain. I can't. There we go. All right. It's a really bad brain, but I just wanted just to visualize what we said. How on earth do people think the brain is a box? And if they would just meditate on that or explain to themselves how they get there, they would start to make themselves act for being an economist, or I should say an associative economist, because maybe that point needs clearing up since you brought it in. The term comes from Steiner, but it is used in various ways, and not only in his world, as it were, among his people who relate to him. If you come into the Latin languages like French, Italian, Spanish, and so on, Portuguese, associative would tend to mean solidarity. It has this mood of it's not really economics, it's social justice in economic life, something like this. This is not what he's meaning. The word associative in Steiner's terms comes from his idea that people, at the point when they've become all separate, they should start associating. And in a way, that's what this story is also saying. You know, this question you asked earlier, it's something to do with the nature of human evolution, or maybe the nature of human existence. That on the one hand, we have a process of separating, becoming self-identified, parallel with wanting to put it all back together again.
Yeah.
And I think that's whether you call that association or cooperation or collaboration, those are subtleties of the language. I think that one needs some kind of fundamental image that the nature of human existence, and therefore economic life and economic history, is the human being will separate himself off in order to become self-aware, and then he or she will also want to put it all back together again, but not in a way that we've disappeared in the process. So the word I think I used earlier was we want to become partners with the gods. That's not to say we want to be gods. That would be a bit hubris of us. But at least we want to be partners with the gods, so therefore not lost in the universal all of before, but not this precocious human being who thinks he can live without gods of some kind. And I think that's in economics. I would say, even if you take a concept like division of labor, and you meditate on that, I don't mean heavy duty, just think a little bit about it, even once or twice, think about it. What's the point? But what he's saying is throughout, and Adam Smith is noticing this, throughout history, the fundamental process is we're dividing the labor. And that will lead us to a point where we'll have to put it all back together again. It's like in the King of Ireland's son story, where Fidelma has to kill him, and she doesn't want to, but she has to kill him and then put him back together again, and she does, but his little finger is in the wrong direction, something like this. But there's in that the image, which I think is true to kind of humanity's spiritual history. We have to kind of ruin or break apart what we are as a whole, and then put it back together again. Hopefully everything would be not as before. That's the little finger problem, not going backwards in order to go forwards. And so I think this is I think this is true in every culture. There's this kind of story that we have to let go of what we've got used to, become ourselves, and want nothing to do with the family, nothing to do with the blood, nothing to do with our past, and then from that place put it back together again. So if you have that idea, then a lot becomes understandable. So just kind of reiterating that. And now if I go into more the methodology of economics, what Steiner means by associative is another way of trying to understand that, or come up inside what his meaning is. He early on in his lectures very quickly goes into methodology, and he makes a very direct point that if you want to understand economic life, meaning if you want to be an economist, let's say someone who understands economic life, you have a problem on your hands, because in the way he describes it, to do that, you cannot think inductively, nor can you think deductively. You have to abandon these two options, and then you will describe something. You will characterize events, or you will characterize the situation, but neither by inductive thinking nor by deductive thinking. So this is a very powerful image. If you were to examine this in detail, which I'm not going to do now, these are the two main ways we think, or we think. We either think from the general to the specific, or we think from the specific to the general. And he says you've got to stop thinking either of those ways. This is again the epistemology. You cannot have this as an intellectual exercise. It will take you to a place in yourself when you deny yourself these two techniques. And then he says, and now you will characterize things. And now you're fit for economics. This is very powerful stuff. And it's not generally, I think, at least in my experience, it's not generally understood about Steiner's economics, this methodological starting point. Not necessarily by his proponents, because with all due respect to my colleagues, they're not necessarily very good on their epistemology. And it's not understood really that it's not necessarily rocket science, because if you come into the English economics, let's say, I don't know if one can say Anglo-Saxon, maybe we'll explore that later, but let's call it Anglo-Saxon economics, the culture in which Keynes grew up, speaking English and living in the constitutional monarchy, and many, many things I could say about what's behind Anglo-Saxon as a term. I know now there is a whole school of thoughts that you mustn't use it because it's racist and I don't know what. But if you characterize the Anglo-Saxon, you come to a very interesting image, which I'll share, that at least in Steiner's view, the people who invaded what became England, they came from Central Europe or from Northern Europe, the Norsemen and so on. And they did this in the time they did this 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, because they were just bursting with surplus will forces. It looks like they were bloodthirsty Vikings taking over the world, all the way around to Sicily and up, and I don't know where they didn't go. These Norsemen, but they just had to expand beyond where they were, because they were carried by this excessive will forces that they had. And that in those days, you could say they didn't know how to tame their will forces. So they just went where their will forces took them. But this is a very important image here, that the actual human being, you could say it's a kind of generosity of will forces that we have, or an abundance of will forces. So we take away the nice nuance of it. In their nature, our will forces is more than we can cope with. And part of our story is we have to learn to cope with our will forces. We have to go with them, because they carry huge news about what we're trying to do that lives in our will, not in our heads. It lives in our will. But you can't give them free rein. That's the whole problem of so-called free market economics. It thinks if you just give will forces free rein, they will lead us to some nirvana. And I think as an English person, not as a Steiner person, as an English person, that is half a thought. So I get we need to have free will, but free will doesn't of itself lead to responsibility. That is something you have to consciously add to the mix. So when you, for example, talk about socially responsible people, I often have issues with that and corporate social responsibility, because hidden inside that can still be the idea that free will is all we need, and get out of the way of my free will, let my free will operate, and it will be social. And I personally think that's certainly not my experience in life, and that's why I rate Rudolf Steiner, because that's also not his experience. Meaning, I'm not saying this because he said it. The reason I found my way to Rudolf Steiner's economics is because he echoes things which for me are obvious. That just, let me be, I go back to my 14-year-old adolescence, death to my parents, death to the teachers, let me get out of this school. Great, right? Until you're there, and then what's so clever about you, right? You've got no degree, you've got no parents, you've got no revenue, you've got no nothing. So you're going to have to build a world which the world around you is going to have to resonate with. Otherwise, you'll have no revenue. So that's kind of my story. When I said I had no pension, I made all these strong statements when I was 16. I was putting myself entirely at the mercy of the world, finding something in me which it would at least pay me for. Otherwise, how am I going to eat?
Yeah.
And so I think, of course, it's biographical, and I'm not saying everyone should quit school when they're 15, but that's my biography, and therefore I have a lot in me which led me to Steiner's work. And I'm not born out of reading Steiner's economics, absolutely not. Whereas I have a lot of colleagues who they start in Steiner's economics, and then they try and put that on the world, but they have no matching experience for it. So for me, this is really an important point. And therefore, if you follow his methodology, he says very early on, he's already said, distinguish between the English economics and German economics. There's real reasons for this, which maybe we will go into, but he starts out sort of saying, get this clear. He also says a very interesting thing about the brain, which is an interesting example of the way Steiner admits what Marshall is saying. So Steiner, in his economics lectures, he's not the kindest person when it comes to natural science, because he often says, and I agree with him, what purports to be natural science is not very good science. In fact, there's a lot of supposition in there. So he's not taking natural science as given. He's very critical of it to make sure it is scientific in its own terms, because often scientific statements are not scientific at all. And today, for example, in COVID, you had what does the science tell us? Well, a lot of what the science said was absolute nonsense. When I flew around the world throughout the COVID time, the social distance would go from 1 meter to 1.5 to 2 to 2.5, even within the same town. So I always said, where's the science in this? Either I cough and it's 1 meter away, or, so what's called science is really dodgy half the time. And so he's very precise about this. Analyze science by the scientific method. And many scientists are very lazy in their suppositions, and especially economists, when they claim to be scientists, they're very restricted in their assumptions, and they don't want to visit their assumptions, because then they would realize they're not up to their topic. If you say resources are scarce, you can immediately put your hand up. Who says, where's the evidence? And as I said in a previous session, they're scarce relative to our greed, relative to our ability to share. They are scarce. The greedier we are, the scarcer they get. So you can't say they are scarce like this. And if you look at any production, any farmer will tell you, I will grow in abundance, or I won't, but nature is just abundant. And what I need for my farm, to feed my family, that's the field near my house. On the wider fields I have, all that's going to the market. Those fields will be sprayed with chemicals, but not the one by the house. So every farmer would tell you that he grows enough for what he needs, and this he keeps really nice. The rest, he can't stop nature growing it, so he has to get rid of it. And so in all the ways you see this, you see the human being in nature is actually abundant of produce, it's abundant of will forces, and our challenge is to manage these, not just to ignore them or kind of put the lid on them and say, I don't have will forces and I'm going to a monastery and I'm going to kind of sit on all that, but to follow this out, follow one's initiative wherever it's going to go, and not say, oh, I better get a job or I better get a mortgage just at the moment when you're about to start something interesting in life. Yeah, and so often you get someone that's just, in Steiner's terms, again, it's a whole other story. You can look at the different phases you go through, and then for him, it's really important. When you get into your 20s, in your 20s, you really need to identify what are your ideals in life, and you need to build your life on what you really want to do. If you don't do this, you're setting up all sorts of illnesses in your whole biography, just the disappointment of not achieving what you set out to do. And that's in itself, that's a whole lecture or a series of lectures. What does it mean for a human being to see what he should be doing in life, what she should be doing in life, and then to say, no, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to get a mortgage, and I'm going to put on hold my whole destiny until I'm 65, when I cannot, in fact, fulfill my destiny. This is such a huge tragedy. And if you know, but that's what so many people do, because what you're going to do in life will show up early on in your life. And you need to kind of see this and trust to this. But you know, it's easy for me to say this because my whole life has been trusting to I don't know what. But I'm not going to ever follow a mortgage, nothing like this. So it's easy for me to say it because it's been my biography. But if I look at the number of people who have missed that point and don't know there's that point, right? They can't unravel the mystery of their life. So many things are messed up because we don't find our ideals and we don't stick to our ideals. We don't even know we've got ideals. And then you're caught on circumstance of life. And this is hopeless.